The envelope landed on Lucian Vale's mahogany desk at 11:47 p.m. Sealed, unaddressed, and final. Inside was a single typed page. A resignation letter. 5 years of loyalty, of covering blood trails and burning documents, and lying to federal agents with a steady voice and dry hands, reduced to 9 sentences and a signature. Celine Ward was already at the service exit when his hand closed around her wrist. She didn't scream. She didn't pull away. She just stood there in the dark hallway outside the ballroom where crystal glasses clinked and Vivian Ashcroft laughed at something charming Lucian was supposed to have said, and she looked at his face and understood, in the sick quiet of that moment, that leaving was never going to be as simple as she'd planned. What would you do? Walk away from the only life you'd ever known, or stay for a man who didn't even know you loved him? If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story to the end, because trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Celine had learned early that the most dangerous people in any room were the ones nobody was watching. She had been 14 when her mother died in a hospital corridor because the insurance paperwork had been filed wrong. 17 when her father's landscaping business collapsed under a debt he didn't entirely understand, signed over to men he never should have trusted. 22. When she graduated top of her accounting program with $38 in her checking account and a very clear picture of how the world actually worked versus how it was supposed to. She had not set out to work for a crime syndicate. She had set out to work for a financial consulting firm in the warehouse district, a respectable enough operation that handled tax optimization for mid-sized businesses. It took her 4 months to realize that approximately 40% of the firm's clients were shell companies, and another 3 weeks to trace those shells back to the Valieri Syndicate, the most quietly powerful organized crime operation on the eastern seaboard. She should have quit. Instead, she had walked into Marcus Thorne's office, Valieri's CFO at the time, set a manila folder on his desk, and told him calmly that his secondary laundering structure had a fundamental error in its depreciation schedules that was going to flag a federal audit within 18 months if nobody fixed it. Marcus had stared at her for a long time. Then he'd picked up his phone and made one call. Lucian Vale had appeared in that office 40 minutes later, 31 years old, wearing a charcoal suit with no tie, and carrying himself with the particular stillness of a man who had never needed to prove anything to anyone in his life. He had looked at Celine's folder. Then he had looked at Celine. "How long to fix it?" he'd asked. 6 weeks, she'd said, "if you give me full access." He had given her full access. She had fixed it in 4.5 weeks. When Marcus tried to take credit for the solution in a boardroom meeting shortly afterward, Lucian had simply looked at Celine and asked her to walk the room through her methodology. She had. Nobody in that room confused who had done the work after that. That was 5 years ago. In 5 years, Celine had become the invisible center of the entire Valieri operation. The woman who knew where every dollar moved, which politicians stayed bought, which federal investigators were susceptible to what kinds of pressure, and where the bodies were buried both literally and financially. She had never fired a gun. She had never needed to. The pen, or in her case the encrypted spreadsheet, had always been more efficient. She had also, somewhere in the middle of those 5 years, made the specific catastrophic mistake of falling in love with Lucian Vale. She was honest enough with herself to call it what it was. Not admiration, not professional loyalty, not the complicated gratitude of someone whose entire career had been built on his trust. Love. The real, inconvenient, humiliating kind that she had never asked for and could not get rid of regardless of how many times she told herself it was irrational. She knew his tells. She knew that he drank black coffee until 2 in the afternoon and then switched to water, that he had a habit of rubbing the third finger of his left hand when he was calculating risk, that he was functionally incapable of cruelty toward animals, despite being perfectly capable of it toward human beings. She knew he respected 3 things above all else: efficiency, honesty, and the ability to stay calm when everything was falling apart. She knew he did not think of her the way she thought of him, or at least, she had told herself that for long enough that it had calcified into certainty. The engagement to Vivian Ashcroft had been announced 6 weeks ago. Celine had been in the operations room when Lucian told his inner circle, watching his face for something, any shift, any hesitation, and had found nothing readable at all. just that same controlled stillness he brought to every room. Victor Ashcroft ran the rival empire that occupied the Western territories and had been in low-grade conflict with the Valieri Syndicate for the better part of a decade. A marriage between Lucian and Vivian was, on paper, a peace agreement, territory division, resource sharing, the ending of a war before it fully started. Celine had told herself she understood, had told herself it was the right strategic move, had spent 3 weeks building the financial architecture for the merged operations, and had done it well, meticulously, thoroughly, without a single error. Because that was what she did. She was useful, she was reliable, she was invisible. And then she had gone home one Thursday night and written a resignation letter because she was 31 years old and she was not going to spend the rest of her life watching Lucian Vale build a future with someone else from a respectful professional distance. The engagement party had been Vivian's idea, or rather, it had been organized by the Ashcroft family's event coordinator with the kind of aggressive elegance that communicated clearly that the Ashcrofts considered themselves the senior partner in this arrangement. The ballroom of the Mercer Grand Hotel, 300 guests, a string quartet, and enough champagne to float a moderate-sized vessel. Celine had arrived 90 minutes early to verify security protocols and stayed long enough to confirm that everything was running smoothly before making her way toward the service exit with a resignation letter tucked in her jacket pocket. She had told herself she was being practical. She had already established a new identity through channels she'd built over 2 years. Quietly, carefully, the way she did everything. A woman named Clara Sims with a clean credit history and a rented apartment in a city 800 miles away. She had a bag packed. She had a plan. What she had not adequately planned for was Lucian. She was 20 feet from the service exit when she heard him behind her. Not footsteps. He moved too quietly for that. Just the particular atmospheric shift that she'd learned to recognize over 5 years as his presence entering her awareness. She turned before he spoke. He was still in his suit jacket, which meant he'd left Vivian and 300 guests without stopping to take it off, which meant he had either seen her leave or been watching for her, or both. His face was its usual careful nothing, but his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was working to keep it that way. "Where are you going?" he said. Not a question. "I left something on your desk," she said. "You should read it when you have a minute." "I already read it." She felt the floor shift slightly under her, the way it did when a calculation you'd been certain of turned out wrong. "That was fast." "Marcus saw you put it there. He called me." He took 2 steps toward her. She did not step back because she had too much pride for that. 9 sentences, Celine, 5 years, and you gave me 9 sentences. I gave you 2 weeks' notice and full transition documentation, she said, and was proud of how steady her voice came out. The Harmon account files are organized by quarter in the blue drive. Castellano's arrangement renews in March. You'll need to negotiate the rate directly. Stop. She stopped. He was close enough now that she could see the slight discoloration under his eyes. That meant he hadn't slept well, which she'd noticed earlier in the evening and cataloged in the part of her brain that cataloged everything about him without her permission. "You're not doing this," he said. "I'm giving you adequate notice. You're not doing this." His voice had dropped below conversational, which she recognized as the register he used when he was operating at his most serious. "You don't leave. Not like this. Not without—" He stopped himself. Something moved across his face and was controlled before she could identify it. "We need to talk." "We're talking right now." "Not in a hallway." "Your engagement party is in there," she said, keeping her voice flat. "Go back to it. I'll be professional. I'll finish the transition. I'm not trying to cause problems, Lucian. I'm trying to—" She caught herself before the end of that sentence, which would have been, "I'm trying to survive this. Make a clean break." "A clean break," he repeated, and something in the way he said it made the words sound wrong, like a phrase in the wrong language. "From what?" She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "From the job, that's all." He knew she was lying. She could see it in the way his eyes held on her face a half-second too long. Lucian Vale had survived in the world he occupied by being extraordinarily good at reading people, and she knew perfectly well that she was not opaque to him the way she was to most people. She had always known that, and it had always terrified her. "The engagement is a transaction," he said. She blinked. "I know that." "Do you?" "I built the financial structure for the merger. I understand exactly what it is." "Then you understand," he said quietly. that it has nothing to do with why you're standing at a service exit at midnight with a coat on. The string quartet was playing something slow and baroque behind the closed doors down the hall. She could hear the murmur of 300 people who didn't know they were standing in a building owned by a criminal empire, drinking champagne on money that had passed through more hands and more countries than they could imagine. She had managed that empire for 5 years. She had been good at it, better than good. And she was standing here with her heart hammering and her face carefully controlled and her entire carefully constructed exit plan collapsing because Lucian Vale had read a 9-sentence letter and crossed a ballroom and grabbed her wrist before she could get out the door. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. She was aiming for professional. She was not entirely sure she landed it. "I want you to tell me what's actually happening." "I need a change." "That's not what's happening." "Lucian, I'm not marrying Vivian Ashcroft because I want to," he said. The words came out with a precision that suggested they had been held back for some time. Victor Ashcroft has 3 sitting judges and 2 federal prosecutors in his pocket. He has material on 4 members of my inner circle that would put them away for the rest of their natural lives. The engagement is a containment strategy. It keeps his operation from moving against mine, and it keeps certain people safe. She waited. The way he'd paused on certain people landed somewhere in her chest. "What people?" she said, and her voice was quieter than she intended. He looked at her, and for a single unguarded moment she saw something in his expression that she had never let herself see before because she had been too careful, too practical, too committed to her own calibrated misreading. Then his jaw tightened again, and whatever had been there was put away. "People I can't afford to lose," he said. Before either of them could figure out what happened next, the far end of the hallway opened. A man appeared, well-dressed, mid-40s, with the particular loose ease of someone who had never been afraid of a room in his life. He looked at both of them with an expression of mild, polished amusement. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, and he didn't sound sorry at all. "Miss Ward, I was hoping to find you." Celine went still in a specific way. The calculating stillness, not the emotional kind. She did not recognize the man. But she recognized the way he was looking at her, the specific attention of someone who had done their homework and knew exactly who she was and had been looking for an opportunity. Lucian's entire bearing shifted beside her, not visibly, not in any way that someone who didn't know him well would catch, but she felt it. "You have the wrong hallway," Lucian said. The man smiled. "Adrian Mercer," he said to Celine, ignoring Lucian entirely with the kind of deliberateness that was its own form of aggression. "I represent the Ashcroft family's strategic interests, and I've been very much looking forward to meeting you, Ms. Ward." He paused. "I think we have quite a lot to discuss, privately." She looked at him. Then she looked at Lucian, whose expression had locked down into the particular blankness that meant he was doing a fast and violent recalculation behind a neutral face. She looked back at Adrian Mercer, who was still smiling, and who had the eyes of someone who knew a great deal more than he was saying. "About what?" she asked. "About the fact," Adrian said pleasantly, "that the engagement your employer just described to you as a containment strategy is actually something considerably more interesting than that." He tilted his head slightly. "And about the fact that you, Ms. Ward, are currently the most valuable person in this building, and the only one in genuine danger of not walking out of it." The string quartet kept playing down the hall. 300 people kept drinking champagne, and Celine Ward stood in a service corridor between the man she loved and the man who had just told her she was the target, and understood, with the precise and terrible clarity that had always been her particular gift, that her clean exit had just become something else entirely. Adrian Mercer had the particular gift of making a hallway feel smaller than it was. He didn't move toward them. He didn't need to. He simply stood at the far end of the corridor with his hands loose at his sides and his expression calibrated to the precise temperature of someone who held all the cards and was in no rush whatsoever to show them. The overhead light caught the silver at his temples. His suit was better than Lucian's, and Celine suspected that was intentional. Lucian stepped forward, just one step, measured, deliberate, but it changed the geometry of the hallway. "You have about 30 seconds, Lucian said, to tell me why you're talking to my people in a private corridor at my engagement party before I interpret this as something that requires a response you won't enjoy." Adrian's smile didn't move. "Your engagement party? That's generous." He looked past Lucian to Celine, and there was something in his gaze that she didn't like. Not threat exactly, but the specific attentiveness of someone taking inventory. Ms. Ward is quite literally the only reason I came tonight. I have no interest in champagne. She's not available for conversation. She's standing right here, Celine said. Lucian's jaw tightened. He didn't look at her. Adrian did. I represent certain interests within the Ashcroft organization, he said to her, but not the interests you'd assume. Victor Ashcroft runs his family the way most patriarchs run theirs, which is to say that the people closest to him are the ones with the least power and the most exposure. He paused. I'm not his man, Ms. Ward. I'm the man who's been watching what Victor has been building for the past 8 months and is determined that when it falls apart, and it will fall apart, I'd prefer to be standing somewhere else. That sounds like a personal problem, Lucian said. It will be everyone's problem, Adrian said, in approximately 6 weeks. He looked at Celine again. There's a position available within a separate structure I'm establishing. Legitimate, or at least significantly cleaner than your current arrangement. I've reviewed your work. The Castellano restructuring, the Harmon offshore architecture, the Meridian shell sequence. All of it. He let that settle. You are extraordinarily good at what you do. And you are currently standing next to a man who is walking into something he doesn't fully understand, which means you are also walking into it. The silence in the corridor had a specific weight. Celine didn't look at Lucian. She kept her eyes on Adrian. What is it that he doesn't understand? Celine, Lucian said, let him talk. The muscle in Lucian's jaw worked once. He let him talk. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small cream-colored card. He held it between 2 fingers without extending it, the way you'd hold something you expected someone to come to you for. The engagement your employer has accepted is not a peace arrangement. It has never been a peace arrangement. Victor Ashcroft doesn't make peace. He makes traps. He finally extended the card. Call the number on the back before midnight tomorrow. After that, the offer expires, because after that, the sequence he's put in motion will have progressed to a point where your involvement in the Valieri operation makes you legally and physically untouchable. Celine took the card. She felt Lucian look at her when she did. Adrian straightened his already straight lapel, a gesture of someone marking the end of a meeting. Enjoy the rest of the evening, he said pleasantly, and walked back toward the ballroom doors and through them and was gone. The corridor was very quiet. Give me the card, Lucian said. No. Celine. He came here to talk to me, she said. That means there's something specific about my position in your organization that made it worth the risk of approaching me at your own engagement party. That's not a card you get to hold. She turned it over. The back had a phone number and nothing else. No name, no organization, no identifying information. A burner number. She memorized it in 4 seconds and would have it for the rest of her life. She tucked the card into her jacket pocket. He said 6 weeks. He said a lot of things. He knew about Harmon. He knew about Castellano. He knew about Meridian. Lucian was quiet for a moment. That's a leak. That's a significant leak, she said. Or someone inside your operation gave Ashcroft a thorough briefing on my work, which means someone inside your operation knew this approach was coming tonight and positioned it. She looked at him. When was the engagement formally agreed to? 8 weeks ago. Then they've had 8 weeks to prepare. Whatever Adrian is warning us about has been in motion for 2 months. She held his gaze. We need to go somewhere we can talk. I have 300 guests. Lucian. Her voice came out flat and certain. Victor Ashcroft has been running a 6-week countdown on something, and one of his own people just broke ranks to warn me about it. The party is over. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him calculating the guests, the optics, Vivian, the performance of normalcy that the evening required. Then something shifted in his face. The calculation concluded, and the conclusion was the same as hers. 30 minutes, he said. I need 30 minutes to manage the room. Go to the operations office on the 4th floor. Don't use the elevator. She went. The 4th floor operations office was where Lucien managed the real business of the evening, a secondary suite of rooms that the hotel believed was reserved for wedding planning coordination, and which in practice housed 3 encrypted servers, a wall of monitors, and a communications array that could reach any of Valieri's operations within a 14-second window. Celine had helped design it. She knew the access code and the location of every camera blind spot, which she used now to move through the stairwell and the fourth-floor corridor without appearing on any of the hotel's security feeds. She sat down at the central workstation, logged in with credentials that technically belonged to a man named Philip Weston, who had retired from the operation 18 months ago, but whose account she'd kept live specifically for situations like this, and started pulling. She started with what Adrian had implied, something in motion for 8 months, a 6-week terminal point, an endpoint significant enough that one of Ashcroft's own senior representatives had taken the risk of approaching the enemy's most valuable intelligence asset at a public event. Those parameters didn't describe a gang war, they described something with a deadline, something with external parties involved, something that required careful, time-sensitive coordination. She pulled the Ashcroft organization's last 2 years of public financial activity first, because that was where she always started, the legal surface, the documented face, the version that existed on record. Then she began cross-referencing against the shadow structures she'd identified over the years through movement patterns, shell company connections, and the particular financial fingerprints that crime organizations left when they tried to present themselves as legitimate. She found the first anomaly in 11 minutes. A series of property transfers in the warehouse district, low value, unremarkable on their own, but patterned in a way she recognized. The transfers created a paper chain that ended in a holding company with no apparent connection to Ashcroft. But the holding company had been incorporated in the same month, in the same state, by the same registered agent as 2 other shells she'd seen in a federal indictment from 4 years ago. Not Valieri's indictment, a federal case against a trafficking operation that had been quietly dismantled and had generated approximately 0 public attention because the dismantling had been managed very carefully by someone who wanted it to be quiet. She stared at that connection for a while. Then she pulled the federal case. She was still pulling threads when the door opened and Lucian came in with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the forearm, and an expression on his face that she recognized as the aftermath of a controlled performance, the slight flatness that settled over him when he'd spent an extended period being someone he wasn't. He looked at her screen. "What did you find?" "Sit down." "I prefer to stand." "Lucian, sit down." He sat. She walked him through it carefully, the way she always did. Not because he wasn't intelligent, but because the connections required the specific kind of patience that financial forensics demanded, and Lucian's intelligence ran toward rapid assessment and decisive action rather than the slow accumulation of detail. She showed him the property transfers, the shell company connection, the federal case. Then she showed him the last thing she'd found 6 minutes before he walked in. It was a filing record, a request for temporary sealing of investigative materials related to a federal joint task force operation. The kind of filing that was routine enough to be unremarkable unless you were looking for it, and was only accessible through a secondary database that most people didn't know existed because she had spent 2 years mapping every publicly accessible federal database and their relationship to each other. The operation code in the filing was the same code as one that appeared in the original federal case she'd pulled. The filing was dated 4 months ago. The jurisdiction was this city. Lucian was quiet for a very long time. "They have a federal operation run," he said. "An active one. Joint task force, which means multiple agencies. The sealing request suggests a scheduled endpoint. They don't seal materials in advance unless they're anticipating a defined moment of action." She turned to face him directly. "Adrian said 6 weeks. This filing is 4 months old. If the operation started then and runs on a standard timeline, 6 weeks to the end of the engagement period," Lucian said. His voice had gone very flat. "The wedding." "They're going to use the wedding," she said. "It's not a peace arrangement and it's not a merger. It's an invitation with a specific date and a guest list that includes every significant player in your organization." Victor Ashcroft agreed to this engagement, knowing that the wedding would function as a mass arrest operation. He handed you the date and the location and the reason to have every one of your key people in the same room. Lucian stood up. He moved to the window which looked out over the hotel's rear parking structure and stood there with his back to her. She watched the set of his shoulders. He was not a man who showed panic, but she had learned to read the architecture of how he held himself, and what she was reading now was something between fury and the particular cold focus that preceded his most dangerous decisions. "Victor's immunity deal," he said. "If he's cooperating with a federal operation, Then he's already cut a deal. Yes, he's giving them the whole structure, yours and his both. A joint takedown that he walks away from. She paused. Vivian knows. Lucian turned from the window. The engagement was her family's proposal, Celine said. Victor doesn't do things without his children's knowledge. It's how he controls their loyalty, by making them complicit. If he's been building this for 8 months, Vivian has known for 8 months. The thing that moved across Lucian's face then was not an expression she'd seen before. It wasn't rage, and it wasn't surprise. It was something colder and more fundamental. The specific reorganization of a man who has just discovered that a threat he thought was in one direction has been directly behind him the entire time. She's been inside my house, he said. 3 times in the last 6 weeks, Celine said. I have the access logs. The security briefings, she sat in on 2 of them. I flagged it at the time as a potential integration concern and was told it was a goodwill gesture. She kept her voice level, even though what she was feeling was not level at all. I should have pushed harder. You couldn't have known. I should have pushed harder, she repeated, because she did not accept the absolution. She had flagged it and let herself be overruled, and that was on her. What I know now is that she has location data on your primary safe house, approximate headcounts for your core operations team, and a rough structural map of the organization's command hierarchy. Whatever she's given to the federal operation, it includes that. Lucian pulled out his phone, started moving toward the door. Who are you calling? She asked. Rains. I need to pull the team out of the Meridian location. Stop. She stood up. Don't use your phone. He stopped. If this operation is as developed as the filing suggests, they've had 4 months to build surveillance infrastructure. Your phones, your cars, the comm system in this office, any of it could be compromised. She crossed to the equipment cabinet against the wall, opened it, and took out a signal-isolated handset that she'd installed there 8 months ago for operational security purposes, and which she now realized, with a chill she kept off her face, had been installed at approximately the same time Victor Ashcroft had been building his trap. Use this, but do not call Rains. Why not? She met his eyes. Because somebody told Adrian Mercer about Harmon, Castellano, and Meridian. Those 3 operations have exactly 7 people read in on their full structure. You, me, Marcus, Rains, and 3 others. She paused. Marcus called you when I put the letter on your desk. Lucian was very still. I'm not accusing Marcus, she said carefully. I'm saying the leak came from inside this room tonight, which means until we know who it is, we don't make calls that expose position or personnel. We move physically and we move quiet. He took the signal-isolated handset without argument, which told her how seriously he was taking this, because Lucian Vale did not typically accept operational constraints from anyone. The safe house on Varden Street, he said. Clean location, not in any briefing Vivian attended. I know it. We go there. Tonight. He looked at her, and for a half-second she saw it again. That unguarded thing from the hallway, the emotion he kept organized out of his face. You were leaving. I was. And now? She picked up her bag from the chair, checked that the signal-isolated handset was charged, thought briefly about Clara Sims and the apartment 800 miles away and the life she'd constructed as an exit, which was still available to her, which Adrian Mercer had just offered her an alternate version of, which she was apparently choosing to walk away from in favor of a criminal organization under active federal surveillance, and the man standing in front of her who had just learned his fiancée was trying to send him to prison. Now we go to Varden Street, she said, and we figure out who burned us. He nodded once. They moved toward the door. And then his phone, the compromised one, the one she'd told him not to use, lit up on the table where he'd set it down. The caller ID read, Rains Mobile. They looked at it. It was 1:14 a.m. Rains did not call after midnight unless something was wrong. Lucian reached for it. Speaker, Celine said. He answered on speaker. Rains. The voice that came through wasn't Rains. It was a man she didn't recognize, low even, professionally calm. And what he said in the 6 seconds before Lucian ended the call was enough to turn the entire night from a conspiracy into something immediate and physical and irreversible. Mr. Vale, we have your operations manager at the Meridian warehouse. If you want him back in the condition you last saw him, you'll come to the shipping port on Kessler Avenue, alone. A pause. You have 40 minutes. Ms. Ward should stay where she is. The call ended. Celine looked at Lucian. His face was stone. They have reins, she said. They have reins, he confirmed, and his voice was the voice of a man who had already made his decision and was now simply in the process of executing it. You're not going alone. The instruction was designed to get you isolated in an abandoned shipping port with no backup, she said, which you know, which means you're not actually considering going alone. You're considering how to appear to comply while positioning support. I don't have support I trust right now. You have me. He looked at her. The operations room hummed around them. Somewhere below them, in the ballroom, 300 people were still drinking champagne, unaware that the evening had already ended. You were leaving, he said again. Quieter this time, like it mattered to him in a way that went past operational concern. I keep making that mistake, she said, and picked up her car keys and walked out the door before either of them could examine that sentence too carefully. Lucian followed her, and the door closed behind them both. And the only thing that remained in the operations room was the glow of the monitors and Raines's name still visible in the missed call log, and the knowledge, settling over everything like cold water, that whoever had set this night in motion had been patient enough to wait 8 months and had timed it down to the minute, and that Celine Ward and Lucian Vale were now moving directly toward the point they could not come back from. The Kessler Avenue shipping port was the kind of place that existed in every city and that nobody thought about unless they had a reason to. A quarter-mile of corrugated steel containers stacked 4 high, a loading dock that hadn't processed legitimate freight in 3 years, and the particular darkness that accumulated in spaces where light had no reason to go. Celine had pulled the port's ownership records in the car on the way over, using the signal-isolated handset, and had found what she expected: a shell company, recently incorporated, registered agent out of state, no operational history. Someone had acquired it quietly and specifically, and had done so well in advance of tonight. They had planned this location. They had chosen it the way you chose a stage set, for what it allowed, for what it concealed. She parked 2 blocks north, behind a freight depot, with enough vehicle cover that the car wouldn't be visible from the port entrance. Lucian had not argued about the location. He had been silent for most of the drive in the specific way that meant he was running scenarios, which she recognized and did not interrupt, because the scenarios he ran were usually better than most people's deliberate planning. How many? He said, as she cut the engine. The call came from inside the facility, she said, which means they were already staged. Minimum 4. 2 on Raines, 1 on comms, 1 watching the entrance. If they anticipated you'd bring backup, add 2 more. They told you to stay behind. They said I should stay where I was. I wasn't where they thought I was. She checked the rear view. The street behind them was empty. They've been tracking your phone, possibly your vehicle. They knew you were at the hotel. They timed this for 1 in the morning because the port is empty and the response time from any legitimate authority is at least 12 minutes. She paused. They did not account for me having a separate vehicle or for us leaving the hotel on a route that doesn't pass a camera grid. You planned for that. I planned for most things. He looked at her. In the dark of the car, she could see the outline of his face and the steadiness of his eyes and the fact that his hands, resting on his thighs, were perfectly still. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of controlled force, like a weight suspended. If I go in the front entrance, he said, they have the angle they want. There's a secondary access point on the south end, she said. Service gate padlocked, but the fence has corrosion at the base. I pulled the satellite image on the way. If you go in the south, you come up on the loading dock from behind. She pulled up the image on the handset and showed him. The dock is the most logical holding location. Contained, multiple anchor points, limited visibility from outside. He studied the image, nodded once. I need 10 minutes before you make any movement, she said. I'm going in through the north side. There's a drainage access corridor behind the first container row. I want eyes on where they're holding reins before you become the distraction. He looked at her again. You're not a field operative. No, she said. I'm the person who knows this facility's layout better than the people inside it, because I spent 40 minutes pulling its records while you were managing the ballroom. She held his gaze. 10 minutes, Lucian. Then you go in the south gate and make enough noise that they're looking at you. A beat. Don't get shot, he said. That's the plan, she said, and got out of the car. The night air at the port was salt-thick and cold, carrying the smell of rust and standing water. Celine moved along the fence line with her back to the corrugated panels, keeping her footsteps on the gravel margin where the surface was more consistent, less likely to shift and announce her. She had her phone off entirely. Not silenced, off, pulled battery, and the signal handset in her jacket pocket set to receive only. She had the port layout memorized from the satellite image. She counted her steps against the estimated distances and found the drainage corridor where it was supposed to be. A narrow passage between the outer fence and the first container stack, barely wide enough to move through sideways, dark enough that she became essentially invisible. She moved through it and emerged behind the first container row with a sightline to the loading dock. There were 4 of them. She counted in the first 8 seconds. 2 flanking the loading dock entrance, 1 on the elevated catwalk above the main floor, 1 she couldn't place yet. Rains was seated in the center of the dock floor, zip-tied to a support post, his head dropped forward in the way of someone who'd been hit recently and had not fully recovered. I was breathing. She could see the movement of his shoulders, but he was not alert. The man on the catwalk had a rifle, which changed the geometry considerably. She did not see the 4th man. That was a problem. She pressed herself against the container wall and did the arithmetic she hated doing. Lucian was going to come in the south gate in, she checked her watch, 6 minutes. When he did, the 2 men on the dock entrance would respond to the sound and the catwalk rifle would acquire him. The 4th man was positioned somewhere to cover an approach she hadn't identified. This was a kill arrangement, not a negotiation arrangement. The offer of returning Rains in exchange for Lucian. Coming alone had never been the actual offer. It had been the method of producing a specific man in a specific location at a specific time. They were not here to take Lucian hostage. She moved, not toward the dock. She wasn't armed and she wasn't a fighter, and she understood her own capacities with the same precision she understood everything else. She moved laterally, along the second container row toward the catwalk's structural support column. The rifle was the primary threat. The rifle had to be neutralized before Lucian came through the south gate, which gave her 5 minutes and 40 seconds. She found the support column and looked up. The catwalk was 12 feet off the ground, accessible via a ladder on the far side. The man on it was looking south, toward the gate Lucian would come through, with his back partially to her position. She looked at the ladder, at the distance, at the man's angle of vision. Then she looked at the cable reel mounted to the container wall at her shoulder height, a heavy-gauge electrical spool, unlocked, used for running temporary power to the dock equipment. It weighed approximately 60 pounds and was mounted on a swing bracket. She thought about it for 3 seconds. Then she put everything she had into swinging the cable reel off its bracket and letting it drop onto the metal decking at the base of the column with a crash that rang through the entire facility like a struck bell. The catwalk man spun toward the sound. She was already moving, back along the container row, away from the column, into the shadow of the second stack. She heard voices, quick and clipped, from the direction of the dock, heard footsteps on the catwalk above. The rifle was no longer pointed south. Lucian's approach window had just opened. She pressed her back to the container and breathed. And then the 4th man stepped out of the shadow 6 feet to her left and pointed a gun at her face. He was younger than she'd expected. Late 20s, with the flat, practiced look of someone who'd been doing this long enough to have lost the nervous edge, but not long enough to have developed the senior man's patience. He looked at her with something between surprise and professional assessment. "Miss Ward," he said quietly. Not a question. She looked at the gun, then at him. "You knew I was coming," she said. "We knew you'd come with him. We didn't know which side you'd come in on." He gestured with the gun, a small, economical motion. "Move. Back to the dock." She moved because the alternative to moving was being shot, and a living problem was solvable in ways a terminal one wasn't. He kept his distance as he walked her. Professional enough not to get within grabbing range, close enough that running wasn't a real option. She cataloged everything as she moved, the dock layout confirming against her mental image. Rains still secured to the post and now lifting his head slightly, the 2 doormen repositioning after the noise she'd made, the catwalk above. She did not hear Lucian, which meant he had come in the south gate quietly enough that nobody knew yet. The 4th man walked her to the center of the dock floor and stopped her 6 feet from Rains. The other 2 men came back to their positions. The catwalk man had descended the ladder. The crash had pulled him down. and was now crossing the dock floor toward her with his rifle slung across his body and an expression of someone recalculating. "She came alone?" one of the doormen said. "Through the north drainage," the fourth man said, took out the cable reel to cover his entry window. The catwalk man, who was, she now understood, the senior operative, stopped in front of her and looked at her the way people looked at things that had surprised them. He was mid-40s, gray at the temples, built with the economical leanness of someone who had stayed in operational shape for a long time. His eyes were the eyes of a man doing arithmetic. "You pulled the port layout on the way here," he said. "I pull everything," she said, "and you came anyway." "Evidently." He almost smiled. It didn't make him friendlier. "The offer Adrian made you tonight was genuine, Ms. Ward. You should have taken it." "I don't take offers from people who take hostages. We took Mr. Raines to create a controlled environment. He's not our target." He looked at her steadily. "You understand what tonight is. You're running in advance for a federal operation," she said. "Tonight is the triggering event. You take Lucian in a compromised location, remove the organization's leadership, and accelerate the timeline before your own operation's exposure compromises it." She paused. "Because someone told you your operation was blown." The arithmetic in his eyes shifted. "Adrian," she said, "Adrian Mercer told you that he'd approached me and that I hadn't taken the offer. Which means you know that I know about the federal operation, which means you know your 6-week timeline is no longer secure." She held his gaze. "So tonight isn't the plan. Tonight is the contingency. You're compressing because you're scared." She heard the south dock door open. What happened next happened in approximately 4 seconds, which was both much faster than she could track coherently and also somehow stretched into a series of distinct, terrible images that she would not entirely be able to discard later. Lucian came through the south door with 2 men she didn't recognize. Not Valieri organization, she didn't know their faces, and the dock exploded into motion. The doormen raised weapons. The catwalk operative stepped back and reached for his slung rifle. The fourth man behind her shifted his grip. Lucian moved. She had never actually watched Lucian in a physical confrontation at close range. She had always been elsewhere when those happened, by design, his and hers. What she saw now revised several assumptions. He was faster than his stillness suggested. The first doorman went down before Celine fully processed that Lucian had crossed the distance, and the second went down a second later with a precision and economy that was almost administrative. One of the 2 men with him engaged the fourth man behind Celine, and the gun at her head was suddenly occupied elsewhere. The catwalk operative had the rifle up. She did the only thing she could do. She stepped directly into his line of fire. He didn't shoot. A man aiming at Lucian Vale does not shoot when Lucian Vale's most valuable operational asset is standing between them, because that changes the calculus entirely. She had understood that about her own position the moment she'd stepped into it, and had stepped into it anyway, which was either very smart or very stupid, and she genuinely couldn't determine which in the moment. "Put it down," she said to the catwalk operative. Her voice came out steadier than her heartbeat. He looked at her over the rifle, then at Lucian, who had gone still on the other side of the dock with his eyes moving between her and the gun. "You're not a human shield," the operative said to her quietly. "You're too valuable for that argument." "You're not going to shoot me to get to him," she said, "because if you shoot me, your operation loses the only person who can actually dismantle the financial architecture. The federal case needs testimony and documentation. Testimony requires me alive. Documentation requires me cooperative." She kept her eyes on him. "So put it down." A very long 3 seconds. He lowered the rifle. Lucian crossed the dock in 4 steps and had the rifle out of the man's hands before the operative finished his breath, and then it was over, the way these things ended. Suddenly, and without ceremony, the energy dropping out of the room like a switch thrown. Raines lifted his head fully for the first time and said, in a voice thickened with a head injury, "Took you long enough." Nobody laughed, but the tension broke slightly, which was its own kind of permission to breathe. They zip-tied the 4 operatives to the dock's anchor posts, the same hardware that had been used on Raines, which was a small justice, and cut Raines loose and got him to his feet. He was concussed, but functional. The 2 men Lucian had brought were efficient and quiet, and he introduced them only as Garin and Pell, which were either first names or last names or neither, and Celine did not ask. They had perhaps 30 minutes before whoever had sent the operatives expected some form of check-in and didn't receive one. Lucian pulled her aside while Garen and Pell managed reins toward the exit. You stepped in front of the rifle, he said. It worked. That's not... He stopped. His hand came up and closed around her arm, not hard, the grip of someone making contact because they needed the confirmation of it. That was not a calculated risk, Celine. It was entirely calculated, she said. The calculus just included variables you weren't running. He looked at her. His hand stayed where it was. The operation is compromised, she said, because they needed to be moving and she needed to be saying something that was about the situation instead of about his hand on her arm. They accelerated tonight because they knew we were close to finding them, which means somewhere in the past few hours, between Adrian's approach and us leaving the hotel, we triggered a warning. Marcus, Lucian said. Flat. Certain. She had been building toward the same conclusion and had been hoping she was wrong. The timing fits. He called you when I put the letter on your desk. He was at the hotel. He knew we went to the 4th floor. She paused. He has access to the full operational structure. If he's been feeding Ashcroft, he's been with me for 11 years. I know. 11 years, Celine. I know, she said again, quietly. Not arguing, not pressing, just staying beside the fact of it. Lucian's jaw moved. He let go of her arm. Something in his face went through a reorganization that she watched without comment, because some things needed the silence to complete themselves. We need confirmation before I move on, Marcus, he said. Yes. Which means we need access to communications records from the hotel from the past 4 hours. I can have them in 20 minutes if you get me somewhere with a clean connection. Varden Street, he said. We go now. They went. The port fell behind them in the dark, the 4 operatives secured to the dock posts and the dock itself empty and echoing. And Celine sat in the passenger seat this time because Lucian drove and she worked, her hands on the signal handset running access queries before they'd cleared the first block. She had the hotel's internal communication logs, extracted through a security backdoor she'd installed in the hotel's management system 2 years ago as a routine precaution, before they reached the Varden Street safe house. She read them while Lucian drove and Rain sat in the back seat with his eyes half closed and his breathing the heavy rhythm of someone fighting through a concussion. She found Marcus's outbound communication at 12:43 a.m. It was a single encrypted message to an external address she didn't recognize, transmitted through the hotel's guest wireless using a device registered as a personal laptop. The message itself was encrypted, and she couldn't crack it in a moving vehicle with a handheld unit. But the transmission existed, and the timestamp was 9 minutes after she and Lucian had left the engagement party ballroom and gone to the 4th floor operations office. 9 minutes. He had waited 9 minutes, long enough to confirm they were gone, and then he had sent the message. She looked at the address the message had been sent to and ran it against the databases she carried, and found it in 40 seconds. A routing node associated with a federal communications relay. Not law enforcement directly. A relay. The kind that intelligence operations use to maintain distance between assets and handlers. Marcus Thorne was not an informant. He was an embedded asset. There was a difference, and the difference was operational depth. An informant provided information when pressured. An asset had been placed deliberately and had been providing information from the beginning, managing what information reached Lucian and what didn't, shaping the operational picture for years. 11 years. She sat with that for the remaining 4 minutes of the drive, and when Lucian pulled into the Varden Street garage and cut the engine, she turned to him and told him what she'd found. She told him precisely, without softening it, because he deserved the exact shape of the thing and not a version designed to be easier. He listened without speaking. When she finished, the garage was very quiet. Rains had gone fully unconscious in the back seat, not dangerously, just the concussed sleep that heads did when they'd had enough. Lucian sat with his hands on the wheel for a long time. 11 years, he said. Yes. He was there when I built this. He was there for every structure, every decision. Yes. He knows where everybody is buried. Lucian's voice hadn't risen. It had done the opposite, compressed, gone dense, the way matter went dense under pressure. He knows about the Castellano account. He knows about the Harmon offshore. He knows about... He stopped. His hands tightened on the wheel once, then released. He knows about you. The way he said it, specifically with a particular weight, made her go still. "What about me?" she said. He turned to look at her. His face in the garage's dim light was stripped of every layer of performance, which she had never seen before, and which made him look briefly younger and more exposed than she was accustomed to. "3 months ago," he said slowly, "Marcus came to me with a proposal. He said the federal pressure on the organization was building, and that we needed to consider. He called it restructuring. He said the most significant liability the organization had was its financial architecture, and that the person who built it—" He stopped. She understood before he finished. "He recommended eliminating me," she said. The word eliminating was clean and accurate, and she used it deliberately because she was not going to perform shock about something she realized, partially known was coming for longer than she'd admitted to herself. The resignation letter, Clara Sims. The apartment 800 miles away. She had not been leaving because she was in love with a man who was engaged to someone else. She had been leaving because some part of her had understood that she had become a liability, and that the man she trusted had been replaced, years ago, with a version of himself she didn't know. "I didn't authorize it," Lucian said, "but he proposed it." "He proposed it, and I told him no, and I didn't tell you because I thought—" His jaw tightened. "I thought I had managed it." "What you managed," she said, keeping her voice level, "was giving an embedded federal asset confirmation that your primary financial architect was still operational, which he immediately communicated to his handlers, which is why the federal operations timeline is what it is. They needed to move before I could be extracted." She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't leaving because of Vivian. I was leaving because Marcus made me feel unsafe, and I couldn't explain why, and I trusted that instinct even when I couldn't source it." Lucian looked at her. The garage settled around them. "He's at the hotel," Lucian said. "He's at the hotel," she confirmed. "If he doesn't receive communication from the operatives at the port in—" Lucian checked his watch. 20 minutes. He'll know the operation failed. He'll either run or he'll escalate." "He'll escalate," she said. "Running means giving up his position. He's been inside for 11 years. He's not built for running." She thought about it. "He'll go to the federal handlers and report that the extraction failed and recommend immediate action, which gives us 12 hours, Lucian said. Maybe less, before they move from a 6-week timeline to an immediate one." She breathed. 12 hours. 12 hours to dismantle an 8-month federal operation, neutralize the Ashcroft family's conspiracy, identify and address an 11-year embedded asset, and do all of it without the organizational structure she'd relied on for 5 years because that structure had a hole in the center of it, the size of Marcus Thorne. She looked at Lucian and found him looking at her, and she understood in that moment that they were the same thing to each other. The only person either of them was certain of, in a room full of uncertainty, in a night that had already remade itself 3 times and was not finished. "I need a clean system in 4 hours," she said. "You'll have both. And I need you to promise me something." "What?" "When this is over," she said, "you burn the letter." He didn't ask which letter. He knew exactly which letter. He looked at her for a moment with the expression and was now willing to name to herself, even if not to him. And then he said, "The letter is already ash," he said quietly. She nodded once, opened the car door, stepped out into the Varden Street safe house garage with 12 hours on the clock and everything she'd ever built on the line and the absolute cold certainty that she was not going to let any of it fall, and began to plan the thing that would save them both or end everything. She started with the money, not because the money was the most urgent problem, but because the money was always the truest map. People lied. Organizations lied. Federal case files got sealed and redacted and managed. But financial records, properly read, told the story underneath the story. The sequence of actual decisions, actual priorities, actual fear. You could reconstruct everything a person was willing to do from the paper trail of what they'd paid for and when. Lucian had set her up in the back room of the Varden Street safe house. A clean space, deliberately sparse, with a hardwired connection that ran through a series of routing nodes she'd established 18 months ago, precisely because she'd always understood that a day might come when the organization's primary systems were compromised and she'd need something entirely off the grid. The connection was slow by modern standards, but untraceable by any standard she knew of. She had 2 monitors, a mechanical keyboard, and a thermos of coffee that Lucian had produced from somewhere without being asked. He was in the front room with Garan and Pell, managing Raines's concussion, and the problem of Marcus Thorne. She could hear the low register of their voices through the wall. Not the words, just the cadence of men working through a problem. She had told Lucian what she needed, and he had provided it, and now they were running parallel tracks in the same building, and that felt, functionally, like the closest thing to a partnership she'd ever had with another person. She filed that thought and went back to the money. The federal operation had a budget. All operations did, regardless of how classified they ran. Money moved, and when money moved, it left traces. And the traces existed in systems that were theoretically inaccessible, but were, in practice, accessible to someone who had spent 5 years building access into every financial system she'd ever needed, and several she hadn't needed yet but had anticipated needing eventually. She was in 3 separate federal procurement databases within the first 40 minutes, which was not legal by any definition, and which she had made peace with on the drive over. What she found in the procurement data confirmed the timeline and added details she hadn't had. The Joint Task Force had been operational for 6 months, not 4. The 4-month-old sealing request had been a secondary filing. The primary operation had been established 2 months before that, which pushed the start date back to a period she calculated quickly against her memory of organizational events and landed on with a cold, specific recognition. 6 months ago was when Marcus Thorne had first raised the question of the Ashcroft engagement. Not Lucian, Marcus. She had been in the room. She remembered it as a strategic recommendation from a trusted senior advisor, the kind of meeting that happened regularly enough that she hadn't flagged it. Marcus had framed it as a threat assessment, had laid out the Ashcroft family's territorial ambitions, had suggested that a strategic alliance, formalized, public, would neutralize the threat before it became kinetic. He had recommended the engagement. He had sourced the idea. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 seconds, because she needed those 4 seconds to absorb the full shape of what she was seeing. Marcus Thorne hadn't been embedded inside the Valieri syndicate feeding information to federal handlers. He had been actively steering the organization, making strategic recommendations that served the federal operations needs, creating the conditions the task force required, constructing from the inside the exact situation that would allow a controlled, comprehensive takedown. The engagement was not something the federal operation had identified and decided to exploit. It was something Marcus had architected and delivered to them. 11 years of building trust in order to spend it on one decisive, catastrophic move. She pulled up the procurement records again and cross-referenced the expenditure categories against the task force's operational phase structure. There were 3 phases: penetration, development, and execution. Penetration had run for years. That was Marcus. Development had been the past 8 months, building the federal case file, establishing the legal framework, coordinating with the Ashcroft family. Execution was the 6-week window ending at the wedding. But there was a 4th expenditure category that didn't fit the 3-phase structure. It was coded differently, routed through a separate budget line, smaller amounts, irregular timing. She followed it through 4 layers of procurement obfuscation and found it in a contracting record for a private security firm that worked, she knew from prior research, exclusively with federal witness protection infrastructure. Witness protection infrastructure. She stared at that for a long moment. Then she cross-referenced the contracting dates against the organizational timeline and found what she was looking for in 30 seconds. The private security firm had been contracted 7 months ago. 1 month before Marcus first suggested the engagement, which meant that before Marcus had even begun constructing the trap, the federal operation had already arranged protection for someone, had already built the infrastructure for moving someone into a new identity. Not a cooperating witness. Cooperating witnesses got processed through standard channels. This was prearranged, private, carefully separated from the main operations paperwork. This was for someone who couldn't go through standard channels. Someone whose identity and situation required a level of operational security that standard witness processing didn't provide. She opened a secondary query and ran the contracting firm's personnel records against her existing databases and found the answer in a form she hadn't expected and which hit her with the particular force of things that are obvious in retrospect and devastating in discovery. The private security firm's primary contractor on this specific account was a former Ashcroft organization operative who had disappeared from the organization's records 14 months ago. Officially departed. No forwarding information. The kind of departure that usually meant either a burial or a very clean exit. Celine ran the operative's identity against every database she had access to, looking for a resurfacing, a financial footprint, a property record, anything that would tell her where this person had gone and why the federal operation had paid for their extraction 14 months before the operation itself officially began. She found it in a property record from a coastal city 3 states away. A rental agreement, signed under a different name, but cross-referenced against a biometric flag she'd placed on the operative's documented physical identifiers 18 months ago as a standard precaution. The flag had never fired, until it fired now against the rental record's attached ID documentation. She looked at the name on the rental agreement. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up the internal comm unit and said, "Lucian, I need you in here." He came through the door in under 10 seconds, which meant he'd been nearby and alert, which meant he'd been keeping her in his operational awareness even while managing everything else. She noted that and moved past it. She turned the monitor to face him and pointed at the name. He read it. She watched his face. "That's not possible," he said. "But the biometric flag doesn't have false positives," she said. "I built it myself." The name on the rental agreement was Elena Thorne, Marcus Thorne's daughter, who had officially died in a car accident 22 months ago, whose death Marcus had publicly mourned, whose funeral Lucian had attended, who was alive in a coastal city 3 states away, under federal protection, 14 months before her father had triggered the final phase of a federal operation that would send Lucian Vale to prison for the rest of his life. Lucian put one hand on the desk, not for support, just contact with something solid. "She's leverage," Celine said quietly. Or she was. Marcus wasn't just an embedded asset running on ideology or money. They had his daughter. The accident was staged. It gave her a clean death and gave the federal operation a hold on Marcus that he could never walk away from. He has been cooperating under duress for at least 14 months. She paused. Possibly longer. Lucian was very still. "He proposed eliminating me," he said, and his voice had a different quality than before. Not the compressed fury she'd expected, but something more complicated. The tone of a man revising an 11-year understanding of a person. "Because his handlers told him to. Because I'm the second most significant loose end after you. He recommended it and you refused," she said, "which the handlers logged, which is why the operative at the port specifically said you were not the target tonight." She met his eyes. "They weren't going to take you, Lucian. They were going to take me. The car explosion they planned, the one you were supposed to witness, would have served 2 purposes. Remove the financial architect so the case can proceed without the risk of someone dismantling it, and give you a trauma response that would be operationally destabilizing at precisely the moment the task force needed you distracted. The silence in the room was a specific kind, the silence of a map being redrawn. They were going to kill you, he said. Not a calculation, just the plain fact of it, stated in the voice of someone who had just determined that something was not acceptable. Yes, she said, and frame it as an Ashcroft move so you'd retaliate, which would give the task force the criminal action they needed to trigger immediate execution of the takedown warrant. She looked at him steadily. Marcus didn't want to do it. He proposed it to his handlers as the minimum necessary ask. The handlers accepted. He has been living with that for 3 months. Lucian straightened. He moved away from the desk, toward the door, and she understood what he was about to do. He's not at the hotel anymore, she said. Lucian stopped. He sent the message at 12:43. It's now nearly 4 in the morning. He knows the port operation failed. He knows we're loose and working. She turned back to the monitor. He's running, which means he's trying to get to Elena, trying to reach his daughter before the federal operation closes around both of them. She pulled up the transport records she'd accessed earlier. There are 3 ways out of this city before dawn. I know which one he'll take. Lucian came back to the desk. He looked at the monitor, at the route she'd highlighted, and then he looked at her. The full-weight look, the one she'd been cataloging for 5 years and now allowed herself to receive without deflecting. You're not just dismantling their case, he said. You're going to give Marcus a way out. I'm going to give Marcus his daughter back, she said, and in exchange, Marcus is going to give me 11 years of federal operational records that will end the task force, expose Victor Ashcroft's immunity deal, and burn the entire infrastructure they built to the ground. She held his gaze. He's not the enemy. He's a man who's been trapped for over a year, and a trapped man with a specific kind of leverage, properly approached, is the most useful asset in any operation. Lucian looked at her for a moment. You've been running this since the car, he said. I've been running this since the hallway, she said. I just needed the data to confirm the shape. He almost said something then. She could see it, the thing that had been moving toward the surface all night, the thing that had been in his face in the hotel corridor and on the dock and in the garage and was in his face now. He held it back, the way he held most things back, which was a discipline she respected and found, in this particular moment, profoundly frustrating. Get the car, she said, before either of them could stay in the moment long enough to make it mean something it couldn't afford to mean yet. We have about 90 minutes before Marcus reaches the transit hub, and when we get to him, let me talk first. The Eastgate Transit Hub was the kind of facility that stayed open all night but barely functioned before dawn. A skeleton crew of 2 ticket agents, 1 security guard who rotated between the main concourse and the parking structure on a predictable 18-minute cycle, and the particular institutional stillness of a building that existed primarily to be a place people passed through rather than stayed in. Celine had pulled its floor plan and security rotation schedule in the car. She had also pulled Marcus Thorne's credit history, his known vehicle registrations, and the 3 properties associated with shell accounts she'd identified as his personal financial reserves, the kind of quiet money that senior operatives kept outside the organizational structure, not for disloyalty, but for survival, the same instinct that had led her to build Clara Sims. Marcus had 1 vehicle registered under a clean identity, a dark blue sedan, 4 years old, unremarkable in every deliberate way. She'd flagged it on the city's traffic monitoring system 20 minutes out from Varden Street and tracked it moving northeast, toward Eastgate, exactly as she'd predicted, because there were 3 ways out of the city before dawn, and Marcus Thorne was 61 years old with a head injury from a life of careful decisions, and careful men under pressure went to the option they'd pre-planned rather than the option that was smartest in the moment. Lucian pulled into the transit hub's south lot at 4:22 a.m. and cut the headlights 2 rows from the entrance. The blue sedan was already there, parked at the far end of the lot, with its engine off and its driver's window cracked the precise amount that a man waiting and listening would crack it. He's not inside yet, Celine said. He's watching the entrance, Lucian said, making sure nobody came ahead of him. Which means he'll see us if we approach from this direction. Yes. She looked at the sedan, at the transit hub entrance, at the security camera mounted above the entrance that she'd already confirmed had a 40-second blind rotation to the east every 6 minutes. Give me the second key fob, she said. He looked at her. The one for the secondary vehicle, she said. Garin drove it. It's in the north lot. He gave it to her without asking how she knew about the secondary vehicle, because he'd stopped being surprised by what she knew approximately 3 hours ago. She took it, got out of this car, and moved along the lot's perimeter fence in the camera's blind window. 40 seconds was enough, barely, if she didn't hesitate. She didn't hesitate. She came around the north side of the building and approached the blue sedan from the blind angle its driver's mirror couldn't cover. She knocked on the passenger window. Marcus Thorne's reaction told her everything about his current state. He went for the door handle first, not a weapon, which meant he was running scared rather than running tactical. She kept her hand flat against the glass, visible, open, and waited for him to register who she was. He registered it. His hand came off the handle. His face, in the dim lot lighting, was the face of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and was exhausted past the point of performing composure. She got in the passenger seat. The inside of the car smelled like fast food and stale coffee and the particular staleness of a man who hadn't slept. Marcus was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no tie, the kind of unremarkable outfit designed to disappear in a crowd. His hands were on the wheel even though the engine was off, the grip of someone who needed something to hold. You tracked the car, he said. I flagged it 8 months ago when I built the contingency files, she said. I flag everything, Marcus. You know that. If you're here, he said, then he's here. He's in the south lot. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked at the transit hub entrance with the expression of a man watching a door he was no longer going to walk through. Elena, he said. Is safe, Celine said. The protection contract is through a private firm. The federal operation can't move her without triggering a contractual notification that I now have access to. She's not in play. She paused. She's not going to be used against you anymore. He looked at her. His eyes were red at the rims and his jaw was carrying 3 days of gray stubble, and he looked, sitting in this parking lot at 4 in the morning, like a man who had lived inside a decision he couldn't escape for so long that the decision had become his entire interior landscape. They told me she'd be processed back into the system if I didn't complete the cycle, he said. Witness protection has a formal process. If her cover is pulled, her cover isn't being pulled, Celine said. I've built a secondary layer around her identity that routes around the federal system entirely. Independent documentation, independent financial infrastructure, 3 degrees of separation from any federal database. She watched his face. She doesn't need their protection anymore. She has mine. Marcus stared at her. I built it in the last 2 hours, she said. It's clean. It holds. The sound Marcus Thorne made then was not a word. It was something that came from a part of a person that operates below language, the sound of a structural weight being removed from something that has been compressed under it for a very long time. He put one hand over his mouth and looked at the windshield and held himself together with the specific effort of a man who had been holding himself together through much worse and was not going to stop now. The passenger door opened and Lucian got in the back seat. Marcus didn't turn around. His hand came down from his mouth. His jaw set. 11 years, Lucian said. His voice was quiet. Not the fury she'd expected. Something more controlled and more final. I need to understand the shape of it. The shape of it, Marcus said, is that my daughter was in the wrong place when a federal operation went sideways, and the handler who approached me afterward was very clear about the arrangement, her safety for my cooperation. He paused. The first 2 years I fed them nothing actionable. Procedural information, organizational structure they could have gotten through basic surveillance. Then Elena's situation became more complicated. Her cover had a gap, they found it, and the leverage got harder. Another pause. The engagement was the price of her permanent protection. You built the trap, Lucian said. I built the engagement recommendation, Marcus said. The trap was already built. They just needed a voice inside to deliver the mechanism. He finally turned and looked at Lucian in the back seat, and what passed between them in that look was something Celine didn't try to read or interrupt. I recommended your elimination to the handlers because they demanded a demonstration of commitment, and because I knew you'd refuse when I raised it formally. I would not. He stopped. There are lines, even here. And Celine. Marcus looked at her. His expression was the expression of a man who had been making impossible calculations for years and had made one too many. I reported her operational status. I didn't know until 6 hours ago that they intended tonight as a removal. His voice roughened. I wouldn't have. Whatever you believe about the past year, I would not have. Celine looked at him steadily. I know, she said. Lucian was quiet for a moment. The federal case file, he said. 11 years of operational information. Evidence structure, witness list, case architecture. I have access to the full file, Marcus said. Handler communications, case memoranda, the immunity agreement with Victor Ashcroft. He paused. I've been keeping copies, not for leverage, for the day the arrangement ended and I needed to be able to prove what I was operating under. I need everything, Celine said. All of it, tonight. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a drive. Small, matte black, the kind of encrypted hardware that serious people used for serious information. He turned it in his fingers once, the gesture of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and was about to set it down. He gave it to her. Elena, he said. I'll send you the access protocols before sunrise, she said. She'll be reachable by morning. He nodded once, the nod of a man whose transaction was complete, who had been reduced by circumstances to the single currency of his daughter's safety and had now spent it and was waiting to see what came after. What came after, Celine had already decided, was Marcus Thorne disappearing into the same infrastructure she'd built for Clara Sims. Because he was 61 years old, and he had spent 11 years in a trap, and whatever his choices had cost, the accounting was complicated enough that she was not going to be the one who ended his story in a parking lot. She told him where to go. She gave him a contact name and a protocol. Lucian sat in the back seat and did not object, which was its own form of consent. Marcus got out of the car. He didn't look back. Celine watched him cross the lot and understood, with the precision that had always been her gift, that she was watching a man who had just made the first free choice he'd made in over a decade, and that it looked from the outside exactly like a man walking away. She moved to the driver's seat, put the blue sedan in gear. "Ashcroft Estate," she said. "We have 6 hours before the task force figures out their case file has been copied and their timeline has been burned." "We're going to the estate," Lucian said, "with a drive in 6 hours." "We're going to the estate," she said, "because Victor Ashcroft has an immunity deal that is contingent on his cooperation remaining secret, and the international cartel he betrayed to get that immunity deal has 3 representatives currently in this city for the engagement negotiations." She pulled out of the lot. "They don't know Victor gave them to the federal operation. They don't know about the immunity deal. They are right now guests at the Ashcroft estate operating under the assumption that Victor is a trustworthy partner." She looked at the road. "Victor's greatest terror is not federal prosecution. It's those 3 men finding out what he did." Lucian was very still in the back seat. "So we tell them," he said. "We send them the file," she said. "Anonymously. Documented. Victor's immunity agreement, his cooperation records, the specific intelligence he provided on their operations." She turned onto the highway. "We don't go to the estate to fight. We go because I need a physical address to route the transmission from a node that puts the origin point inside the Ashcroft property, so when the cartel's security people trace the leak, they trace it to Victor's own network. Making it look like an internal breach. Making it look like Victor panicked and tried to negotiate a secondary deal, which is entirely consistent with his operational history." She pushed the car to speed. "By the time Victor understands what happened, the cartel will already be moving on him. The federal case will have lost its star witness and its primary cooperating party. And Adrian knew," Lucian said. "He came to the party. He warned you." "Adrian has been running a parallel play," she said. "He represents Ashcroft interests, but not Victor's interests specifically. He saw the trap closing and made a lateral move, offering me a position in a post-Victor structure he was already building." She thought about it for a moment. "He's not our enemy, and he's not our ally. He's an opportunist who made a correct read and acted on it, which I respect and which I will deal with separately and cleanly." "And Vivian." The highway opened up ahead of them, and she pushed the car harder. The city's edge was visible now, the density of lights thinning toward the outlying districts where the Ashcroft estate occupied 6 acres behind a stone wall and a gate system she had already, in the past 40 minutes, mapped to its last camera position. "Vivian Ashcroft has spent 8 months participating in a conspiracy to send you to prison," Celine said. "Whatever her father's coercion or her own ambitions, she made choices. I'm not interested in her suffering." She paused. "But I'm interested in her having nothing left to operate with. No influence, no position, no leverage. The engagement ends tonight, and it ends in a way that makes it impossible for her to reconstruct anything from it." "How?" "Because when Victor falls, he takes the family's entire political infrastructure with him. The judges, the prosecutors, the arrangements he's maintained for 15 years, all of it documented in the file Marcus gave us." She glanced in the rear view at Lucian. "Vivian's power is entirely derivative. Without Victor, she is a woman with a social network and no machinery." Lucian looked at her in the rear view. His eyes in the mirror were the eyes she'd been avoiding looking at directly for several hours, because looking at them directly cost her operational focus, and she could not afford that yet. "After," he said. "After," she agreed. They reached the Ashcroft estate's outer perimeter at 5:08 a.m., 47 minutes before first light. Celine had already mapped the camera grid during the drive and had identified a maintenance access point on the property's east boundary, a service road used for groundskeeping, gated with a mechanical lock that used a standard key code she had extracted from the estate's property management records. She drove past the main gate without slowing and took the service road at the east boundary without headlights. The code worked. The gate opened. She drove the car 200 meters in and stopped in the tree coverage and killed the engine. The estate's main structure was visible through the trees, a large stone building, partially lit, with the specific lighting pattern of a property where not everyone was asleep. Security presence would be higher than usual with cartel representatives on site. She counted 3 visible patrol points from her current position. She opened the drive Marcus had given her and began working. The connection she needed was the estate's private network, which ran on a separate infrastructure from the public-facing systems. She'd identified the network's physical relay points from the property records, a series of boosters mounted on the estate's outbuildings. The closest booster was 60 meters from her current position. "I need 12 minutes at that booster," she said, uninterrupted. "The patrol rotation passes the booster every 9 minutes," she said. "I have a 3-minute window starting in 4 minutes." She looked at him. "I need you to create a distraction at the north fence that pulls the East Patrol off their rotation for approximately 90 seconds. "What kind of distraction?" "Loud enough to be a perimeter concern, not loud enough to be an incursion. A vehicle alarm works. A triggered motion sensor works better." She pulled the estate's security system diagram on the handset. "There's a motion sensor array at the north fence's midpoint. If someone moves along the fence line in the sensor range, the system flags it as a potential perimeter breach and pulls 2 patrol units to investigate." "Someone," Lucian said. "You're faster than I am in a field," she said, "and I need to be at the booster." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Not reluctance. More the specific quality of attention. A man gave something he didn't want to examine too carefully before doing it. 90 seconds, he said. 90 seconds. He got out of the car without another word and disappeared into the trees toward the north fence, and she moved toward the booster with 4 minutes on her internal clock and everything that mattered balanced on the next 12. The booster was mounted on the side of a groundskeeping shed, 3 feet off the ground, accessible without tools. She had a hardware interface in her kit, the kind of compact device that cost more than most people's monthly income, and that she had purchased 18 months ago and kept in a waterproof case at the bottom of her operational bag because she believed in specific preparation for specific eventualities. She jacked into the booster's maintenance port, ran the handshake protocol, and was inside the estate's private network in 90 seconds, 2 minutes and 45 seconds remaining in her window. She didn't copy files. She didn't navigate the network structure. She had one task: locate the estate's internal communication node, the server that managed outbound communications to the cartel representatives' devices, and route a single transmission through it. The transmission was already prepared, compressed, addressed. Victor Ashcroft's immunity agreement, his cooperation records, 40 pages of documented betrayal, addressed to the 3 encrypted contact points she'd identified in the cartel's communication infrastructure through cross-referencing Marcus's file with her own intelligence records. She found the node at 2 minutes and 10 seconds. She ran the transmission at 1 minute and 50 seconds. It went. 40 pages of Victor Ashcroft's treachery, routed through his own estate's private network, addressed to the men he'd betrayed, appearing to originate from an internal source within his own organization. She disconnected at 1 minute and 30 seconds, packed the hardware interface, and was back in the tree coverage at 1 minute flat. Lucian came out of the north tree line at 40 seconds, moving fast and quiet, with the particular controlled breathing of someone who has been running and is managing the evidence of it. A distant alarm was still cycling at the north fence. She could hear the patrol units responding, voices clipped and rapid. He reached her position and looked at her. "Done?" he said. "Done." They moved back to the car. She drove out the service road the way they'd come in, through the maintenance gate, back onto the road, and away from the Ashcroft estate at a speed that was fast enough to matter and slow enough not to announce itself. The sky to the east had the specific quality of pre-dawn, not light yet, but the color of the dark beginning to change, the first suggestion of a world that was about to be visible. Her handset vibrated at 5:31 a.m., an alert she'd set up to flag any activity on the Ashcroft estate's external communication channels. She looked at it. Incoming communication to the estate. Encrypted. Origin. The cartel's primary communication infrastructure. 23 minutes. That was how long it had taken for the file to be received, read, and acted on. 23 minutes from the transmission to the first response, which told her the cartel's representatives had been awake and alert and had people on their encrypted channels who understood what they were reading the moment they read it. Victor Ashcroft's night had just become something entirely different from what he'd planned. She was about to put the handset down when it vibrated again. A different alert. This one from the monitoring flag she'd placed on the Federal Task Force's communication infrastructure. She read it. Then she read it again. "Pull over," she said. Lucian looked at her in the rear view. "What?" "Pull over right now." He pulled over. She held the handset so he could see the alert. The Federal Task Force had just filed an emergency motion to accelerate the operation's execution timeline. The filing cited a compromise of case materials and a potential loss of the primary cooperating witness. It was time-stamped 5:29 a.m., 2 minutes ago. 2 minutes after the cartel had received the file, which meant someone inside the Ashcroft estate had detected the transmission and alerted the federal handlers within the same window. The task force wasn't waiting 6 weeks. They weren't waiting 6 hours. The filing requested immediate authorization for a dawn operation. Dawn was 41 minutes away. Celine looked at the time, looked at the filing, ran the arithmetic in the specific way she ran arithmetic when the variables were lives rather than money, and the margin was measured in minutes rather than weeks. The case file is compromised, she said, speaking fast. Marcus is gone. The cartel is moving on Victor. The immunity deal is functionally void because the cooperating party is about to be a criminal target rather than a protected witness. All of that is true. She looked at Lucian. But the task force doesn't know that yet. They know the case materials were copied and they know their timeline is blown, but they haven't had time to understand what's been done to Victor's position. They're moving now because they think speed is their last remaining asset. They're going to hit the estate, Lucian said. And your organization's safe locations simultaneously, she said. Dawn sweep. Multiple targets, synchronized. She looked at the road. Varden Street is in the filing as a secondary target. Rains was at Varden Street. Guerin and Pell were at Varden Street. Lucian had his phone in his hand. The compromised phone. Doesn't matter now, she said. They're executing in 40 minutes. Operational security on our communications is secondary to getting our people out. She looked at him. Call Rains. Move everyone from Varden Street. You have 30 minutes before the task force stages. He called. Rains answered on the second ring, groggy and concussed and functional enough. The conversation was 40 seconds. Rains understood, which was why Lucian had kept Rains for 11 years, regardless of Marcus's influence. Celine was already working the handset. The task force filing had a case number, and the case number was the thread she needed to pull the operational warrant's full scope. The list of locations, the list of targets, the legal architecture of the entire Dawn sweep. She pulled it in 4 minutes through the federal database access she'd built into her system and read through the target list with a speed that came from years of knowing exactly what she was looking for. The list had 11 locations. 6 were Valieri operation sites. 3 were neutral financial institutions where accounts would be frozen. 2 were personal residences. One of the personal residences was hers. She had not been to her apartment in 36 hours. There was nothing there that connected her to the organization's financial infrastructure. She had been meticulous about that for 5 years, keeping her operational work entirely separated from her residential footprint. But her residential address was in the warrant, which meant the federal operation considered her a primary target, which meant that the past 5 years of invisible work were no longer invisible. She had spent 5 years being the woman nobody looked at in the room. The task force had been looking at her for months. She sat with that for a moment, not with fear, but with the particular recalibration of someone who has just had their understanding of their own position revised. They're coming for you specifically, Lucian said. He'd seen her face. They need me to build the financial case, she said. Live testimony, documentation, walkthrough of the architecture. She paused. I'm the prosecution's entire evidentiary foundation. Then we need to move. We need to do something first, she said. Her voice had gone to the register she used when she had identified a solution and needed the space to execute it. The immunity deal is void. Victor is compromised. The case file is in our possession. But none of that stops a dawn sweep unless the task force knows its legal foundation has collapsed. How do we make them know that in 40 minutes? She looked at him. We don't make them know it, she said. We make the court know it. She was already moving, already opening the federal case filing interface, already pulling the duty judge's emergency contact protocol. The immunity agreement is the legal cornerstone of the entire operation. If the cooperating witness's immunity is formally challenged before the sweep executes, if someone files an emergency motion demonstrating that Victor Ashcroft is himself a target of active criminal retaliation and therefore cannot function as a protected witness under the terms of the agreement, the warrant gets stayed, Lucian said. The warrant gets stayed, she confirmed. The duty judge issues a temporary hold pending review. The task force cannot execute during a judicial stay. She looked at the screen. I have Marcus's full documentation of the immunity agreement. I have the cartel's response communication, which I captured off the estate network. I have the transmission record showing the file originated from inside the estate. She paused. I can build the filing in 20 minutes. You can file a federal emergency motion at 5:30 in the morning. I can file it through the public emergency petition system, which operates continuously and routes directly to the duty judge's clerk. She looked at him. It's not orthodox. Is it legal? The petition system is legal, she said. What I'm petitioning with is complicated. He looked at her for a long moment. The sky was getting lighter. 38 minutes to dawn. Build it, he said. She built it. 22 minutes, 4 seconds. She knew because she tracked it against the countdown in her head, the way she tracked everything. She used the legitimate petition framework, structured the filing correctly, attached Marcus's documentation and the transmission capture as exhibits, and argued in clean, precise legal language that the immunity agreement underpinning the federal case had been fatally compromised by the cooperating witnesses' exposure to criminal retaliation, rendering the warrant's legal foundation void pending judicial review. She filed it at 5:53 a.m., 14 minutes before dawn. At 5:57 a.m., the duty judge's clerk logged the petition. At 6:01 a.m., the task force's operations commander received a notification that a judicial review petition had been filed against the operational warrant and that execution was stayed pending the duty judge's ruling. She knew this because she was still inside the federal communication infrastructure and was watching it happen in something close to real time, the way she watched everything, precisely, completely, without the luxury of emotion until the work was done. Lucian was watching her face. It held, she said. He let out a breath. For now, she said, because she was constitutionally incapable of offering a certainty she didn't have. The stay is temporary. The judge reviews at 8 a.m. We have 2 hours. 2 hours to do what? She looked at him. Outside the car windows, the sky was going from black to the particular dark blue of the last minutes before actual dawn. The color of something ending and something else not quite started yet. In 2 hours, a federal judge would review an emergency petition filed by a woman whose apartment was on a federal warrant list, based on documentation provided by an embedded federal asset who was currently disappearing into a false identity she'd built, regarding an immunity deal with a man who was probably already dealing with the consequences of 3 very dangerous people receiving very specific information about his choices. 2 hours. To make sure, she said, that when the judge rules, there is no case left to rule on. She looked at the eastern sky, where the light was coming whether anyone was ready for it or not, and she understood with the cold and final clarity of a woman who had spent her entire adult life seeing the architecture beneath the surface of things that the next 2 hours were going to determine everything. Not just survival, not just the organization, but the specific shape of what came after, and who she was going to be in it, and whether the thing she'd been building toward for 5 years was going to be allowed to exist. She put the car in gear. The 2 hours felt like a single held breath. Celine drove while Lucian worked the phone, the compromised one, because operational security had become secondary to speed, exactly as she'd said. He pulled his people out of Varden Street in the first 20 minutes, cycling through contact after contact with the clipped efficiency of a man who had run crisis logistics before, and understood that the difference between a managed emergency and a catastrophe was usually the first 30 seconds of decision-making. Rains was mobile. The secondary safe locations were being vacated. The financial accounts she hadn't already moved were being shifted through the emergency transfer protocols she'd built into the organization's structure 2 years ago and tested twice and hoped never to actually use. She drove, and she thought, and she did what she always did when the variables were moving faster than comfortable. She reduced the problem to its essential structure and worked from there. The federal case rested on 3 things: Victor Ashcroft's testimony and cooperation, which was now functionally destroyed because Victor was currently the subject of cartel attention that would make his participation in any federal proceeding impossible. The financial documentation that Marcus had provided over 11 years, which was now in her possession and which she intended to ensure never reached a federal courtroom in usable form. And the legal architecture of the warrant itself, which the emergency petition had stayed pending judicial review at 8 a.m. The petition was well constructed. She knew that because she had constructed it, and she did not build things that were not well constructed. But a well-constructed petition survived on the quality of its evidence, and the duty judge reviewing it at 8 a.m. would be looking at her exhibits and making a determination about whether the immunity agreement's compromise was sufficient grounds to void the operational warrant. She needed one more thing, something she hadn't had when she filed the petition, something that would make the judge's determination not just possible but inevitable. She needed Victor Ashcroft's immunity agreement to be formally withdrawn, not challenged, not contested, withdrawn by the federal prosecutor's office itself, on the grounds that the cooperating witness had become a liability rather than an asset. Prosecutors withdrew immunity agreements rarely, but they withdrew them when the cooperating party's credibility was so thoroughly destroyed that proceeding with the agreement created more legal risk than abandoning it. She pulled up the federal prosecutor's office emergency contact protocol on the handset, pulled the duty prosecutor's information, looked at the time, 6:09 a.m. "I need to make a call," she said. Lucian looked at her from the passenger seat where he'd moved when she'd taken the wheel back. "To who?" "The duty federal prosecutor." She kept her eyes on the road. "I'm going to tell them that their cooperating witness's immunity agreement has been compromised by active criminal exposure, that I have documentation of the compromise, and that proceeding with the agreement will destroy the case's credibility in front of any judge who reviews it." "You're calling a federal prosecutor." "I'm calling a duty prosecutor at 6 in the morning to offer them a clean exit from a legal disaster," she said. "The agreement is already void in practice. I'm giving them the paperwork to make it void, in fact, before the 8 a.m. review makes it void by court order, which is considerably messier for them professionally." She glanced at him. "Prosecutors don't like court orders that expose the structural failures of their operations. They prefer to manage the collapse themselves. And in exchange for the voluntary withdrawal, the petition becomes moot and the warrant is vacated without a judicial ruling that would create precedent." She pulled onto the highway heading back toward the city center. No ruling means no public record of the operation's failure. No public record means the task force disbands quietly rather than spectacularly. And a quiet disbandment means the federal interest in the Valieri organization's financial architecture disappears without generating the kind of institutional momentum that produces follow-up investigations. Lucian was quiet for a moment. "You're offering them a way to lose without it looking like losing," he said. "I'm offering them the least damaging version of an outcome they cannot avoid," she said, "which is not the same thing as a favor. It's a transaction." She looked at the road. "The only currency I have that they want more than a successful prosecution is a failed prosecution that nobody finds out about." She made the call at 6:14 a.m. The duty prosecutor was a woman named Calloway, who answered on the third ring with the voice of someone who had been awake for hours and was operating on caffeine and the specific adrenaline of a professional watching her morning go wrong in real time. Celine did not introduce herself by name. She identified herself as the individual who had filed the emergency petition at 5:53 a.m., which Calloway had clearly already read because the quality of her attention sharpened immediately. Celine spoke for 4 minutes. She was precise, factual, and entirely without emotion, which she had found was the most effective register when speaking to lawyers about problems they wanted to make disappear. She told Calloway exactly what she had, exactly what it demonstrated, and exactly what the duty judge was going to do with it at 8 a.m. if Calloway's office didn't act before then. Then she told Calloway what she was offering. The silence on the line lasted 11 seconds. She counted. "I need to verify the documentation," Calloway said. "I'll transmit it to the secure intake address in the next 10 minutes, Celine said. "You'll have 40 minutes to review and decide before the judge's clerk opens the petition file." Another silence. 5 seconds. "The immunity withdrawal would be conditional," Calloway said carefully, "on the documentation being authenticated." "It will authenticate," Celine said. "It came from the cooperating party's own files." Another silence. 3 seconds. "Transmit it," Calloway said, and ended the call. Celine transmitted the documentation at 6:23 a.m. She sent the immunity agreement, Marcus's cooperation records, the cartel's response communication, and the network transmission log showing the file's origin point inside the Ashcroft estate. 41 pages of evidence that Victor Ashcroft had simultaneously betrayed a federal investigation's operational security and exposed himself to lethal criminal retaliation, making him the least viable cooperating witness in the history of the task force's operation. At 7:11 a.m., The federal prosecutor's office filed a voluntary withdrawal of Victor Ashcroft's immunity agreement. At 7:19 a.m., the task force's operational warrant was vacated as legally unsupported. At 7:34 a.m., Celine pulled the car into the parking structure of a hotel she'd never used before and had no connection to, and turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the specific stillness of a person who has been in motion for so long that stopping felt structurally wrong. Lucian sat beside her. He was looking at the parking structure's concrete wall. His hands were in his lap. He looked, she thought, the way people looked when something they'd been bracing against for months failed to arrive. Not relief exactly, which required the luxury of certainty, but the careful, provisional lowering of a posture held too long. "It's done," she said. "Victor," he said. "Victor has 3 cartel representatives at his estate who received documented proof of his betrayal 2 hours ago," she said. "His federal immunity is withdrawn. His family's political infrastructure is detailed in documentation that is currently in my possession and will find its way to the appropriate authorities through channels that cannot be traced to either of us." She paused. "Victor Ashcroft is going to spend whatever remains of his operational capacity trying to survive the consequences of his own decisions. He is not a factor in your operations going forward." "Adrian." She thought about Adrian Mercer, who had stood in a hotel hallway at 1 in the morning and made a calculated offer to the right person for the right reasons, and had been present enough to understand that the engagement was a trap before most people involved had admitted it to themselves. "Adrian made a lateral move, and it was a correct one," she said. "He's going to resurface. He's building something without Victor's fingerprints on it, which means he's going to occupy a position in this city's structure that didn't exist before tonight." She looked at the wall. "I'll know more about what he's building in about 2 weeks, when the financial movements settle." And Vivian. Vivian Ashcroft woke up this morning as the daughter of a man whose federal immunity has just been withdrawn and whose cartel allies received a detailed account of his betrayal before breakfast, Celine said. She has no political capital left that isn't attached to her father's name, and her father's name is now attached to a catastrophic multi-front collapse. She turned to look at Lucian. She made her choices. This is what choices cost. He nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't satisfaction. It was the acknowledgement of an accounting. They stayed in the parking structure for a while. The city was waking up outside. She could hear the ambient sound of it through the concrete, the traffic and the movement of a place that had no idea what had been decided in its dark hours. She thought about that sometimes. How many cities had been quietly reshaped in the hours before their residents opened their eyes? How many structures had fallen and been replaced before anyone who lived inside them noticed the change? "Marcus," Lucian said finally. "On his way to a coastal city," she said. "Under a name I built. With a daughter who is no longer in a federal protection arrangement and has a new clean identity that I built from different materials than the federal version, which means it doesn't collapse when the federal operation collapses." She paused. "He won't come back." "No," Lucian said. "He won't." He was quiet for a moment. 11 years. "Yes. I keep saying that. Because it keeps being true," she said. 11 years is a long time to be wrong about someone. It deserves the weight you're giving it." He turned to look at her. His face was exhausted in the physical way. The red at the eye margins, the particular gray undertone that came from a night without sleep, the stubble that had progressed past 5 o'clock to something more substantial. He looked like a man who had been through something, which was accurate, and he looked like a man who was still in the middle of processing what it meant, which was also accurate. "You were going to leave," he said. "I was leaving," she said. Present tense, active tense. The bag was packed. "Because of Marcus." "Partly." She held his gaze. "Partly because I had been standing in the same room as you for 5 years telling myself a specific story about what I was to you, and I had decided I was done telling it." "What story?" She looked at him for a moment. She had said it almost last night, at the dock, with a rifle between them and everything burning, and she had not quite said it then, and she thought that what distinguished a woman who had survived the past 12 hours from the woman who had walked into them was primarily the understanding that partial honesty was its own form of self-destruction. "That I was useful to you," she said. "Reliable. The person you called because she didn't make mistakes and didn't ask for things, and didn't complicate the operation with inconvenient feelings." She kept her voice even. I had decided I was tired of being useful. He was very still. You stepped in front of a rifle, he said. I explained the calculus. Celine. His voice had dropped to the register he used when he needed to be heard precisely. I watched you step in front of a rifle. Whatever the calculus was, I watched you do it, and I understood in that moment that there is no version of the organization, or of any strategic structure, or of any outcome I am trying to build that is worth more than the fact of you being in it. He paused. I should have said that at the hotel. I should have said it 3 months ago when Marcus made his recommendation, and I refused and didn't tell you, which was its own form of the same cowardice. She breathed. You burned the letter, she said. Before I left the 4th floor, he said. I put it in the document incinerator. A beat. I was not going to let it exist. She looked at him for a long moment. The parking structure was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a truck was reversing, its alarm marking the slow, deliberate movement of a world that had no idea it was being observed by 2 people who had just spent a night rewriting its hidden architecture. The organization needs restructuring, she said, not just financially. The operational security framework is compromised at its core. The personnel trust network has to be rebuilt from a smaller base. And the financial architecture Marcus had visibility into needs to be dismantled and rebuilt with different structural logic. She paused. That's a significant project. How long? Done properly? 6 months minimum. She looked at the concrete wall. Done in a way that actually holds rather than just appears to hold, closer to a year. Then we should start, he said. We should sleep first, she said, briefly, and eat something. And she stopped. And I need you to say it clearly, Lucian. Not the letter, not the rifle. What you're actually saying. He looked at her, then he reached across the console and took her hand. Not the urgent grip from the hotel hallway, not the reflex contact from the operations room, but the deliberate, considered hold of a man who has thought about what he's doing and done it anyway. Stay, he said. Not as my financial architect. Not as the person who covers the mistakes and manages the structure and makes the organization function. His hand tightened slightly. Stay as the person who stepped in front of a rifle and filed a federal petition at 6 in the morning and built an identity for a 61-year-old man who didn't deserve to be abandoned. A pause. Stay as my equal. Whatever that means in practice, we figure it out. She looked at his hand on hers. She thought about Clara Sims, waiting in an apartment 800 miles away, and about the resignation letter that had already been ash before she'd even reached the service exit, and about the specific kind of love that survived 5 years of being unspoken and a night of being tested by every conceivable form of pressure and came out the other side, not fragile but harder, more precisely itself, the way materials became harder under the right application of the right force. Equal, she said. Equal, he confirmed. That means I'm in the room for every significant decision. You've been in the room for every significant decision for 5 years. I mean, acknowledged, she said, not the invisible hand, the visible one. Yes. And the restructuring happens on my timeline, not yours. If I say 6 months, it's 6 months. Agreed. And the Harmon account needs to be dismantled entirely, she said. It's been compromised since Marcus had access, and I've never been comfortable with its structural dependencies. I want to start from a cleaner base. He was almost smiling. She could see it at the corner of his mouth. We're negotiating organizational terms in a parking structure. I negotiate in whatever environment is available, she said. That's why you've kept me for 5 years. The almost smile completed itself. It was the first time she had seen it happen fully in the past 12 hours, and it reorganized his face in the way that specific expressions did when they reached the eyes, the genuine ones, the ones that came from somewhere below the managed surface. Come on, she said, and released his hand and opened the car door. They found a diner 2 blocks from the parking structure, the kind that opened at 5 in the morning and served coffee that could remove paint and eggs, that came without ceremony and had been doing exactly this for 40 years, and would continue doing it regardless of what had happened in the city's hidden hours. They sat in a booth by the window and ordered without looking at the menu because neither of them was in a state for decisions more complex than scrambled or fried, and the waitress brought coffee immediately, which was the right instinct. Celine wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the street outside. The city was in full morning motion now. people going to work, deliveries being made, the ordinary movement of a place conducting its ordinary life. She had always found something settling in that, the persistence of the ordinary, the way it continued regardless of what occurred in the spaces between its awareness. Her handset buzzed. She looked at it. A news alert. Local financial reporting, the kind she'd set to flag relevant organizational names. The headline was about the Ashcroft family's primary holding company, trading suspended pending a regulatory review of financial irregularities. Below it, a secondary alert. A prominent civic leader connected to the Ashcroft family's political network had declined to comment on reports of federal irregularities in a property development deal. Victor's world was beginning to come apart at the seams in the places where the daylight touched it. The cartel's response would take longer. Those things moved through different channels, with different timing. But the financial and political infrastructure was already reacting to the withdrawal of the federal immunity that had been quietly insulating the Ashcroft family's operations. She turned the handset face down on the table. Not her problem. Not today. Lucian was watching her. Done? He asked. Done, she said. The eggs arrived. They ate. The coffee was as bad as it looked, and she drank 2 cups because the quality of the coffee was not the point. Outside the morning continued to be itself, indifferent and persistent, and inside the booth, 2 people who had built and nearly lost and ultimately kept the structure of their lives ate breakfast in the particular silence of people who had run out of things they needed to perform for each other. 3 days passed before she went back to her apartment. She had stayed at a hotel, a clean one, different from the hotel where the engagement party had occurred, booked under a variation of a backup identity she maintained for exactly this kind of operational gap. She had slept for 11 hours the first night, which was more than she'd slept consecutively and longer than she could accurately recall. She had eaten real meals. She had sat for long periods in front of a window watching the city and doing nothing, which was an activity she had largely forgotten was possible. Lucian had given her the space. She had not asked for it explicitly, he had recognized it, which was its own form of the changed understanding between them. He had called once each day with operational updates. The restructuring's initial phase, the personnel decisions, the first meetings with the smaller trust network that was replacing the compromised one, and had not asked her when she was coming back, which meant he understood that she would come back when she was ready, and that ready was not a timeline she owed him. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. The careful, sparse organization of a woman who had been prepared to abandon everything in it with 20 minutes' notice. There was something almost amusing about that, in retrospect. All that preparation for a departure that had never quite happened. She packed a different bag than the one she'd packed for Clara Sims. Smaller. Not a disappearance bag, the kind of bag a person packed when they were moving towards something rather than away from it. She found the original resignation letter on her desk, a copy she'd kept, force of habit, the woman who documented everything. She read it once, standing at the desk in the morning light. 9 sentences, professional, final, a very clean piece of writing about a decision she had already made and then unmade before the ink was dry. She put it in the kitchen sink and burned it herself. She watched it go, the paper catching, curling, the words disappearing in the order they'd been written, the signature last. The smoke rose for a moment, and then the ventilation took it, and the ash in the sink was gray and light and the precise weight of nothing. She rinsed it down the drain. The offices Lucian had established for the restructuring were on the 14th floor of a building in the financial district. Legitimate, glass-fronted, the kind of address that read as exactly what it was presenting itself as. She had chosen the building. She had reviewed the lease. She had had opinions about the floor layout that had been incorporated into the final configuration, which was a small thing but a specific one. The conference table was positioned so that the 2 seats at the head of the table were side by side rather than facing each other. She arrived at 9 on the 4th day. The team that had been assembled, smaller than the previous structure, more carefully selected, built on a different model of trust, was already present. She recognized some faces and was introduced to others, and she was introduced by Lucian as his partner, which was the word he had chosen deliberately, and which landed in the room with the specific gravity of a word that was doing real work. She did not make a speech. She sat down, opened her files, and began going through the Harmon account's structural dependencies with the same precision she brought to everything, because the work was where she had always been most precisely herself, and that had not changed. What had changed was everything around the work. The way people in the room addressed her. The way decisions routed through her as a matter of structure rather than as an exception when her specific expertise was needed. The way Lucian, seated beside her rather than across from her, consulted her during discussions as a matter of course rather than a matter of deference. She was not invisible. She had decided she was done being invisible. 2 weeks after the night of the engagement party, Adrian Mercer sent her a message through a channel that told her he'd spent those 2 weeks locating it, which told her something about both his resources and his patience. The message was brief. Characteristically, he noted that the situation had resolved in a manner he found professionally impressive, extended something that read as genuine respect rather than performance, and indicated that he expected their paths would cross again in whatever structure emerged from the current reorganization of the city's landscape. She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Lucian with a single annotation: "Manage him carefully. He's useful." Lucian's response came back in 4 minutes. "I'll leave that to you." She had looked at that response for a moment and understood that it was not delegation. It was the recognition of her jurisdiction, the acknowledgement that some decisions belonged to her now, not because she'd been assigned them, but because she'd earned them, and because the structure they were building was built on that principle. That authority followed competence, and that competence, in their particular enterprise, was demonstrated rather than inherited. Raines recovered from his concussion fully by the end of the second week. He came to the 14th floor offices on a Tuesday morning, moving carefully but moving, and sat across from Celine while she walked him through the operational security framework they were building to replace the compromised one. He listened with the focused attention of a man who understood that what he was hearing was not a briefing from a support function, but from the architecture of the operation itself. At the end of the meeting, he said, "You should have been here from the beginning." "I was here from the beginning," she said. "You know what I mean," he said. She did. "Yes," she said. "I should have been." The engagement announcement was formally withdrawn on the 22nd day through a brief statement from the Ashcroft family's remaining legal representative citing mutual agreement and changed circumstances. The statement was 5 sentences long and said nothing, which was the most accurate thing the Ashcroft organization had produced in several months. Vivian gave no comment. The financial press covered the Ashcroft Holding Company's ongoing regulatory difficulties with considerably more interest. Victor Ashcroft's situation resolved itself in the way these things resolved, when a man had made enemies in multiple directions and had removed his own protections. Celine did not track the specifics. She had given the cartel the information, and the cartel had their own processes, and the outcome was not something she was responsible for. She had not arranged it as punishment. She had arranged it as a consequence, which was a different thing, and the difference mattered to her even if it would not have mattered to most people examining the facts from outside. On the last evening of the month, the offices were empty except for the two of them. The team had left at 6, and she and Lucian had stayed, as they often did, because the work did not arrange itself, and they were both, at their cores, people who found the work absorbing in a way that made the concept of stopping feel slightly artificial. She was at the window when he came to stand beside her. The city at night had a different quality than the city at dawn, denser, more self-contained, the light from 1,000 windows suggesting the lives being lived behind them without revealing their content. She had looked at this city's surface for 5 years and known what moved beneath it. Now she was part of what moved beneath it in a way that was acknowledged and deliberate and permanent, and that was different from being invisible, and the difference was not subtle. "The Harmon migration finishes tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "The new shell structure is cleaner, less exposure on the secondary tier." "I know," he said again. And then, after a moment, "Celine." "What?" "We can talk about Harmon in the morning." She looked at the city, then at him, standing beside her with his hands in his pockets and his jacket off and his sleeves rolled in the way she had learned to read, as meaning he was done performing for the day, done maintaining the surface, down to whatever version of himself existed without the managed presentation. "Yes," she said. "We can." The city moved below them. The work would be there in the morning, the accounts to restructure, the operations to rebuild, the careful and patient construction of something more durable than what had existed before, built this time on a foundation that had been tested by the worst available pressure and had not broken. That was what they had learned, in the end, not that they were invulnerable, but that they were not fragile, that the structure held when the structure was real. She had burned a letter in a kitchen sink and packed a different bag and come back to a room where she was seen, and the man standing beside her had chosen the word equal in a parking structure at 6 in the morning and had meant it, and those were not small things, and she was not a woman who treated significant things as small in order to protect herself from feeling their weight. She let herself feel the weight. Outside, the city that had no idea what had been decided in its name continued being itself, persistent, indifferent, and entirely unaware that the invisible hand that had always moved through its structures was invisible no longer, and that the woman who had spent 5 years being the shadow behind the power had finally, completely, and without apology, stepped into the light.